Do you feel like you are in control of your actions? And if you do, how can you be sure of this? How do you know that there aren't actually hidden influences guiding your behavior that you are unaware of? This is one of the central tenets of depth psychology, that we are not the masters in our house, but that there may be any number of unconscious factors influencing our behavior. The term depth psychology refers to any description of psychology which notes the existence of the unconscious mind and posits the unconscious as an important factor in understanding psychology. As such, it is important to consider the unconscious mind as a factor when treating psychological difficulties. The relationship between the unconscious and consciousness can be likened to that of a rider and a horse. The rider can attempt to direct the horse and is often successful, but what happens if the horse gets spooked? Then it is the horse who decides where to go, and the rider is carried along for the journey. Another metaphor which may illuminate the idea of the unconscious mind is that of an iceberg. The part of the iceberg which floats above the surface of the water makes up only a tiny proportion of the entire iceberg, in the same way that consciousness makes up only a small proportion of our minds. There are many unconscious factors which influence our behavior, and these are often derived from our personal experiences and life history. Certain experiences become so ingrained into our psychic constitution that they continue to influence us long after they have occurred, and we have forgotten about their origin. Internal conflicts can occur if our unconscious mind fails to cooperate with our consciousness, and it is not uncommon for the unconscious mind to have its own way of thinking distinct from that of consciousness. The idea of an unconscious mind was difficult for empiricists to accept. The first descriptions of the unconscious came from philosophers like Carl Gustav Caras, who proposed that our field of conscious awareness makes up only a tiny portion of our psychic processes. Since we can only be conscious of a few things at any given time, there must be a significant amount of psychological functioning which occurs subliminally or beneath the threshold of consciousness. In fact, since the unconscious makes up such a large percentage of our psychology, we could even say that the unconscious is really in control of our actions. Oftentimes, our reasonings for our behaviors are conscious stresses applied after the fact, and we often create justifications for our behavior as acts of consciousness, when really it was the unconscious that decided for us. The great decisions of human life have, notes Carl Jung, as a rule, far more to do with the instincts and other unconscious factors than with conscious will or well-meaning reasonableness. For empiricists, the notion that there was an entire sphere of the mind that we couldn't observe directly didn't make any sense, especially since empiricism is built on the ability to make observations about the phenomenon in question. The unconscious, by definition, can't be directly observed. Despite this, thinkers have been able to provide evidence for the existence of the unconscious mind. Even modern science has largely confirmed this fact. For instance, memory priming is a phenomenon where a past experience changes a person's capabilities without them even being aware of it. For instance, people who were shown an image for 1 to 3 seconds were contacted 17 years later to try and identify the same image, but displayed in a fragmented way which made the images hard to identify. These subjects were compared to people who hadn't seen the images before. According to the author of the study, priming was dissociated from episodic memory, in that it was present even in subjects who reported no conscious recollection of their participation in the original laboratory session. These findings suggest that the perceptual representation system is an invulnerable memory system functioning below conscious awareness. In other words, contents in the unconscious were influencing the experimental results, and the subjects, many of whom had forgotten that they had ever seen the original images, were nonetheless able to identify them. The existence of the unconscious is also implied by our everyday experiences. Imagine you are having a conversation with someone on a specific topic. Now imagine that someone else suddenly interrupts you to ask you an unrelated question. Your conscious mind needs to shift from one topic to another, but when you return to your original conversation, you are able to recall what you had been speaking about. This is possible because even though your consciousness is directed away momentarily, the original conversation still occupies your unconscious mind. Recalling the original conversation is an attempt to bring the conversation, now relegated subconsciously, back into consciousness. These and other observations has led psychologists to conclude that the unconscious mind definitely exists. But how does this knowledge aid us in psychotherapy? It was the psychologist and founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, who first attempted to describe the nature of the unconscious in such a way that this knowledge could be used in the treatment of neuroses. In recognizing the deeper truth of Darwin's theory of evolution, Freud realized that human beings have an unconscious instinctual nature. This nature, according to Freud, is largely occupied with the satisfaction of pleasure, as biological organisms are driven primarily by their desire for food and by their desire to reproduce. Humans are fundamentally no different, and Freud referred to this animal side of human nature as the id, believing that it was the sexual impulse which was the main influence over the psyche. The powerful unconscious impulses arising from the id come into conflict with an entity which Freud called the superego. The superego consists of all of our ideals and expectations levied upon us by society, and is in some sense responsible for our sense of morality. Our moral nature, which comes to us through the progressive evolution of cultural values, is at odds with the unconscious side of ourselves. As such, our conscious mentality, called the ego, must navigate between these two extremes. Since social ideals are often in conflict with our instincts, there is a tendency for the id to be repressed into the unconscious, where it nevertheless continues to direct our behavior. This repression does not eliminate our cravings for pleasure, but rather these cravings may begin to interfere with our rational, conscious intentions, often without the person noticing that he or she is being manipulated by unconscious factors. In addition to the id, Freud believed that the ego intentionally represses memories that it deems too disturbing. These repressed contents don't disappear, rather they continue to influence our behavior from the unconscious. Freud called these unconscious disturbances complexes, and his method of psychoanalysis was an attempt to discover the unconscious complexes by examining the history of the individual and analyzing their unconscious minds by several methods, including the method of free association. This method involves asking the patient to think of the first word that comes to mind when they look at a list of given words, the idea being that their choice of word reflected their unconscious tendencies. The goal of this and other methods was to help make the unconscious conscious. Insofar as complexes remain unconscious, we are certain to be influenced by them, often with detrimental effects. However, if we could become conscious of our complexes, then we would be better equipped to deal with them and navigate through life without being at the mercy of our complexes. Thus, consciousness is an important tool, and expanding our self-knowledge gives us the ability to live without being impelled by unconscious influences. This following example might throw light upon these ideas. Imagine a person who strongly dislikes his work environment and their boss, and yet whenever they interact with their boss, they need to put on a sort of mask which hides their resentment and anger. This repression of anger may suddenly explode upon another person, such as their spouse, who receives all of the anger which the person repressed. Hence, repression of psychic contents does not remove them from the psyche, but creates the possibility of these contents returning into behavior at inappropriate times. Being aware of this tendency, however, may allow the person to better understand the factors governing his or her behavior, so that they can negate or reduce the harm done by the repression. One of Freud's contemporaries, Carl Jung, largely agreed with Freud's insights on the nature of the psyche. However, Freud's view of the unconscious as a sexually perverse, pleasure-seeking animal was untenable for Jung, whose own observations led him further and further away from this view. It was Carl Jung who expanded the model of the unconscious to include inherited biological factors, as well as personal factors derived from one's individual existence, whereas Freud had emphasized the personal nature of the unconscious. Jung divided the unconscious into two parts, which he called the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. The personal unconscious is acquired in the course of one's life, and is determined by a person's life history, the experiences that shape them, and mold their behaviors and thoughts. After a while, these elements become so ingrained into the psyche that a person may not be conscious of their influence. The collective unconscious, on the other hand, is not acquired at the individual level, but is the part of the psyche which is inherited, and can be thought of as pre-existent elements of psychic functioning. This archetypal psyche is innate, and represents the instinctual patterns of thought which are the result of the evolution of the human species. The collective unconscious is a part of the psyche which can be negatively distinguished from the personal unconscious by the fact that it does not, like the latter, owe its existence to personal experience and consequently is not a personal acquisition. While the personal unconscious is made up essentially of contents which have at one time been conscious, but which have disappeared from consciousness through having been forgotten or repressed, the contents of the collective unconscious have never been in consciousness, and therefore have never been individually acquired, but owe their existence exclusively to heredity. Whereas the personal unconscious consists for the most part of complexes, the content of the collective unconscious is made up essentially of archetypes. Jung realized that the unconscious is structured by an archetypal nature which, without us knowing so, influences our thoughts and actions. Any idea, thought, or observation can become unconscious, and in the unconscious, continue to exert an influence over a person's thoughts and actions. For instance, the way you speak or phrase sentences may be the result of the way you are educated, and yet through habit, you may no longer be conscious of the exact reasons for your particular way of speaking or thinking. In practicing depth psychology, like Freud, Jung believed that neurotic disturbances were traceable to the unconscious. As such, if you could discover what it was in the unconscious that was making you think or feel a certain way, you could adapt to this situation and prevent the unconscious from controlling your life. For both Jung and Freud, the unconscious attempts to make its presence known to a person in the form of images, particularly those images which arise spontaneously during dreams. When we sleep, our consciousness rests, wherein our unconscious minds begin to express itself in the form of dream images, which can be thought of as an attempt by the unconscious mind to express ideas and insights which, for one reason or another, are not normally accessible to consciousness. Oftentimes, dreams express those thoughts which we actively repress, and so during dreams, the mind is given a chance to explore ideas which the conscious mind may deem unacceptable. As a result, dreams provide material for depth psychologists, who can then try to identify the nature of their patients' minds. Jung described the general process for the acquisition of unconscious psychic material in the following way. Every conscious act or event thus has an unconscious aspect, just as every sense perception has a subliminal aspect. For instance, sound below or above audibility, or light below or above visibility. The unconscious part of the psychic event reaches consciousness only indirectly, if at all. The event reveals the existence of its unconscious aspect, inasmuch as it is characterized either by emotionality or by a vital importance that has not yet been realized consciously. The unconscious part is a sort of afterthought, which may become conscious in the course of time by means of intuition or by deeper reflection. But the event can also manifest its unconscious aspect, and this is usually the case in a dream. The dream shows this aspect in the form of a symbolic image, and not as a rational thought. It was the understanding of dreams that first enabled us to investigate the unconscious aspect of conscious psychic events, and to discover its nature. This highlights one important difference between Freud and Jung, and that is that Jung believed that any content could become unconscious, not just those which are actively repressed. There is a lot to say about the theories of depth psychology and how they can be applied to psychotherapy, but for this video, we will attempt to describe one familiar problem using a depth psychology model. Procrastination is something we are all familiar with, and a quick internet search will yield any number of explanations for why we procrastinate. As we will see, attempting to explain procrastination through depth psychology is both helpful and often entirely consistent with other explanations. Imagine that you were a student and you need to work on an assignment or needed to study. You begin to work on your computer, but decide that before you actually start to work, you might as well browse the internet for a while and check in on social media. When you're done, you move on to your assignment, but may realize that your mind isn't cooperating, and, rather than getting started, you feel more inclined to go back to browsing. From the perspective of depth psychology, your mind is still thinking about whatever you saw on the internet. In a sense, your mind is still processing this information in the unconscious. This activity has split off from your conscious awareness and continues to exist separately in the unconscious, where it interferes with your conscious intentions. This is made worse by the fact that the mind constantly craves novelty, and probably finds the internet and social media more appealing than doing work. The unconscious then tries to bring your attention back to social media, which is why you may find it difficult to focus on the task at hand. The solution to this is to avoid allowing your mind to experience things which are irrelevant to your primary conscious intentions, so that your unconscious mind doesn't interfere later on. In other words, try to focus on only one thing at a time, without introducing any novelty. Of course, this is more difficult today in a world of endless novelty, but these insights about depth psychology may give you an understanding of why procrastination can be so challenging. This might be difficult if your unconscious contents are so emotionally charged as to become complexes. Complexes are more pathological and more exerting than other unconscious contents, which are comparatively benign. As Jung notes, it is just as if the complex were an autonomous being capable of interfering with the intentions of the ego. Complexes indeed behave like secondary or partial personalities in possession of a mental life of their own. However, the psyche seems to have a self-regulating mechanism, which enables unconscious contents to become conscious, usually through dreams or through creativity, which can often be understood as an artist depicting the contents of their unconscious. This illustrates the importance of not ignoring your unconscious mind, as the unconscious frequently seizes hold of a person despite their well-meaning conscious intentions. By making the unconscious conscious, we may better orient ourselves amidst the psychic tension between our highest ambitions and our instinctual and unconscious nature.